interviews for the Metro Housing Coalition over, it was kind of a 2-year period because of COVID, but so today I'm going to be talking to some of the people I interviewed. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. So let's start out with Michael Meeks. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Michael Meeks, I'm the Chief Equity Officer for Louisville Metro. Born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and very happy to participate.
All right, and his sister, Renelda Meeks Walker.
That's right, that's me. I was actually born in Tuskegee, but we left Tuskegee and came right back to Louisville, Kentucky. So from 1951, we lived in Louisville. I'm now in Poughkeepsie, New York. I worked in New York City for 35, 40 years.
Okay, and thank you. Verná Goatley.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for this opportunity to speak. My name is Verná Goatley. I'm the Executive Director of Louisville Metro Human Relations Commission. That is under the Office of Equity for Local Louisville. And I'm a transplant. I call myself a Army brat that was put here by my parents and graduated high school and been a Louisville resident since.
All right. Thank you. And Frank Walker's supposed to be with us. Frank, are you there?
I guess I'm here.
All right. Yeah.
I haven't really gotten adapted to the technical age. Frank Anderson, Louisville, Kentucky, born and reared in Smoketown. And just been in Louisville, Kentucky all my life, except for the time that I was in the military. And that's about it.
All right. Renelda and Michael, I think that it was very interesting for me to have two siblings in the discussion. And both of you talked about kind of how Parkland changed when you were growing up. Michael, you talked about being a young man and how close the neighborhood was, how diverse it was. And then before like the 68, when there was the protest. And then Renelda, you were actually there for it. You know, you're a bit older. So could you guys talk about how the community changed before, how it was before and how it changed afterwards?
Well, so Parkland is where we lived actually. But at the beginning, I remember going to school, elementary school, 1956, which was Brown versus the Board of Education. And although I could see the Parkland Elementary School from where I went to bed at night, our parents decided we were going to go to Virginia Avenue, which was 12 blocks away. That was the Black school at the time. So it was a very comforting, it was a community school, that's what I would say. At that time, it was like the experience was one of a small community. So all the teachers were Black, there were male and female teachers. The principal lived across the street, a couple of teachers lived down the street. So we were all pretty close to, and they were welcoming to our parents. So parents could walk into school at any time. So our elementary school was just provided an exemplary experience, educational experience for us. That was a really important anchor. And it gave us like the impetus to go a little bit further. We did better than, well, I don't want to step on any toes, but we think that we did, it was easier to manage the elementary school than the kids who went directly to a newly desegregated school. So that, you know, we just sort of sailed right on into the educational system. It was wonderful. I remember it to this day, and we're still friends whenever I see somebody's name.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us about the day that the uprising that happened in '68 and how it impacted the community and housing.
So you should know that that's a big difference. I was a senior at that time. So I was getting ready it was 1968. I was in college or getting ready to go to college. And to me, it was just a regular gathering, an event. I didn't see it. I never saw it as a riot. Mm-hmm. Let's see. I think, as I said, I remember listening to as many young people did all across the country. They would have, you know, people who were passionate about something, and I guess they call it a soapbox. You'd get up on a soapbox and you'd talk about, it would be anti-war, anti-racism, flower children. But this one day, a bottle came sailing across on top of everybody, and it's exploded. It wasn't a bomb or anything. It was just somebody threw a bottle, and that created what became known as a riot.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, you talked about how the stores that you had gone to, all the amenities started slowly leaving the neighborhood.
Yes. So I don't really remember the elementary school, the white elementary school closer to the house. I just remember Virginia Avenue being, you know, our elementary school, and it was, yes, the village that we needed to excel. After the uprising in Parkland, everything changed. The police, there was a heavy police presence. The National Guard came in, and we really felt as a community that almost like an invasion, you know, and a lot of the stores that closed after the uprising never came back, or either they came back in a much smaller version. You know, they were much more guarded, and it wasn't the same in terms of a economic hub. Parkland just steadily went downhill in terms of providing the residents with what they needed. So yeah, it was definitely a traumatic event for the entire community.
Mm-hmm. And Verná, you live in Shawnee, but you had talked about the trouble you had trying to get a loan for home improvements in your house. What we expound a little bit on that?
Well, just being an average citizen, trying to do some upgrades on my property that I have been in for about 20 years, and thought that I could check all the boxes in order to make that happen. And when I went to my financial institution that I did business with to try to get some assistance with doing some home improvements, I was turned away and told that my numbers didn't fit, that the ratio of what I owned on the property and what I was looking to get wasn't comparable to what they could do at the financial institution, which I was only looking at like a $10,000, and I couldn't understand it and stuff. And so therefore, it made me look at other means in order to get the work done. But it was just like, okay, I have good credit. I have a good income coming in. I pay my bills. My credit score was good and all of that, but I didn't fit what they wanted me to have in order to get the financing I needed.
Mm-hmm. And Yeah, so you went to L Homes. Is that where you finally got help?
Yes, I went to L Homes and submitted an application, and everything went very well there and stuff. And, you know, they kind of understood what was going on because they had other residents that were in some of the neighborhoods, the West Louisville neighborhoods, that were going through some of those same type of issues.
Mm-hmm. And while you were having trouble getting a home improvement loan, you were constantly having people trying to buy your house, weren't you?
Constantly. That's a everyday thing almost. I'm getting calls not only on my private number, but my work number even. People have walked up to my door and rung the doorbell, you know, asking if I was interested in selling, and, you know, they were in the neighborhood, moving around and stuff like that. So, yeah.
So, and Frank, you had talked about the same thing, hadn't you?
And she just, Ms. Renee just brought up some things that I went through. You know, I get a postcard in my mailbox just about once a week, showing my home, said we interested in your home. And then I don't really want to get in contact with those folks because I don't really want to continue them harassing me, because to me it's just harassment, because several times I've had situations happen like that, and they'll tell me what they would give me for my home, acting like I'm one of those persons who actually really need money. And to the fact, you know, in other words, I look at it like dangling shiny trinkets in your face, and you're supposed to just jump at it just because they offer you money. And then I find out after looking at all the homes that are around me, I live down Shining Terrace, that all the homes that have been around me that's a lot smaller than I have, with less square footage, they've gone in and they've knocked out a wall here, knocked out a wall there, and where it used to be a 2-bedroom, they managed to get 6 bedrooms in it. And now they selling anywhere from mid $100,000 up to maybe $210,000 around this neighborhood. We all know that it's white plight. They're trying to come back, and we know it's an investor's gold mine right now. They want to give you little as they can give you, and then they'll turn around and they'll flip it for 5-6 times more than what they paid you for it. But they expect you to take their offer, really. I mean, sometimes they kind of just get mad because you don't take their offer.
Yeah, and you talked about your property tax going down, even though you've made a lot of or your property value going down, even though you made a lot of improvements to your home.
Well, yeah, my property value went down. When I bought this property, I paid like 70, I think 72, 73. And then with the improvements and things I put into it, well, it went up to 109. That was back maybe about 10 years ago. Between 109, then one time it went up 113,000. And then now, last time I went to get me a home improvement loan, just like Ms. Goatley said. Well, you know, it was one of those things. All the many years that I had banked with Fifth Third Bank, I mean, for 20, 30 years more, and they tell me, you know, that they can't help me, or my property is not valued at what I said was valued at. Of course, you know, there's a difference between your property value that the city gives as the fair market property value. A lot of times here in the West End, our property taxes went down lower than what the fair market value is in surrounding areas. I'm on a 3-story home, 3,000 square foot. If you would add everything up right like it should be. And I have a 3-car garage with a loft in it. If that house was in the East End or maybe probably the South End, it'd be well worth up to $200,000 to maybe possibly $300,000.
I wanted specifically to Michael, can you talk about a lot of, we focused on housing, but a lot of things about where people work and education came up based on your zip code. And so can you talk about maybe the connection to where you live and the opportunities you get? So, yeah.
Where you live and the opportunities. Well, certainly in the West End, in our neighborhood, I'll give you my experience. We lived in a close-knit neighborhood that had well-educated people, neighbors in there. We had teachers and doctors, and went to a very community school or community-oriented school that had Black teachers, and that really prepared us for other educational experiences. I think all of my siblings went to different high schools, different colleges, and different professional schools. And all of us have done fairly well. But certainly there are other areas in the West End that will not afford that type of experience. But it is important. I think most people have stressed that education is the way to go. It may be more generational than it is anything else. In a lot of areas, we've lost that connection where you're getting reinforced by your relatives to do better. And they don't have a lot of good counseling from people that care. It may relate to the churches, individuals not attending church as much. That is certainly an institution that helped as well. But I think there are a lot of factors that go into individuals not, being as successful as they could, and living up to their full potential.
Yeah.
Renelda, go ahead. I was going to ask you a question, but if you got something to add.
Well, I was basically going to say that there were several systems in place for success. And the church, of course, was one of them, because if you remember, there in the early 1900s, there were over 100 Black towns across the United States. And these Black towns were created to create safety for a group of people that were not safe all over the country, the United States. And so in our community, in 40211, we had the church, which was relatives, friends, and neighbors. We had that school, which was Virginia Avenue, now Carter. We had institutions that were protective of us. Our family values were the same values that we saw at the school. Our family traditions were the same as we had at church, and with neighbors. And when we visited in a safe area. So that was a really important part of that neighborhood that's important. And we should always remember how we come together to provide comfort and joy and safety for our families.
But may I add something to what?
Sure.
I forget your name, ma'am. But
Renelda.
You said systems in place for safe neighborhoods. Now I think there's systems in place for the opposite. Systems in place for certain neighborhoods and communities to fail. We as a Black community or Black race or whatever, we hear it, and the way I look at it, because I go to a lot of meetings, different types of groups that I associate with. But I see us self-segregating ourselves, because right now the big ploy is anything west of west of 6th Street, then they changed it to west of 9th Street. And even our so-called black leaders, they always advocating for improvements in the West End, but we forget that there's multiple Black communities here in the city of Louisville that our city government is not advocating and not putting money aside for those neighborhoods. Now, I might live in the West End, but I have a lot of relatives that live out in the Valley Station area. I have some that live in the Fern Creek area, especially one predominantly is Newburgh area. Like I said, I was born and raised in Smoketown. Smoketown was at the time where Warner Street was supposed to be booming. Smoketown was a booming business area also for black businesses. And it was almost like when you partied here in the Smoketown, and then you went to Walnut Street area, and then you did your partying. So it kind of like family members intermingled together in both spots. And then also certain places out in Newburgh, they were business-minded Black business owners. So now we have gotten to the point where we even self-segregate ourselves, and we're allowing our so-called Black leaders to self-segregate us also. And then I noticed with a lot of things that's going on under Mayor Fisher's administration, we're allowing his administration to select our Black leaders. And if you look at just about every thing that he has started, every panel, every board he has got, it's always the same Black leaders. Now, my thing is, do they actually represent our best interests in mind? What's going on here in the city of Louisville? I don't think so.
Well, that's one thing actually I was going to ask, because we've seen a lot of talk about revitalizing West Louisville, and Mayor Fisher said that there's like more than $1 billion in projects that are, either announced, completed, or in the getting ready for construction. So Frank and Verná, I wanted to ask you if you're feeling that impact of the investment in your community.
I don't feel it's a lot of investment that's coming Shawnee. It's a lot going on in the Russell neighborhood. They are have all kind of different programs that are happening that is helping the Russell neighborhood, but it hasn't creeped down to the Shawnee neighborhood. One of the programs that we have at Metro is the program in the house to help with housing, that they have funds that they give to people to do upgrades on their housing. And it's open, the beginning of our fiscal year, July 1. And for that same program by July 10th not be available, to turn people away and say, well, we've taken in as many applications as we could, to accept for the amount of money that we have. And it wasn't spread it around very good. I had a lot of people that were calling me about it. And I don't even work in the housing department and stuff. I couldn't believe, 10 days in the application process, and they're no longer accepting applications. But I did see where the Russell neighborhood has received some monies that they're able to do some home improvements, but it's only for residents of the Russell neighborhood. So what happens to the other 8 West Louisville neighborhoods that are needing that same type of assistance and help? They don't have, those things available to them. So it's, it's kind of a one-sided thing going on.
Mm-hmm. I wanted, this is for all the panelists. I wondered if after participating in the oral history project, if it changed your perspective on your housing history or how you viewed, you know, preserving these stories. So.
I can start with that. I think the oral history has brought us history from generations and from centuries past. So that's a good bet. And I think that it's oral history is colorful, it's intuitive, and that and genetics and the census has been a real gift to us as Black people. So I think, you know, our family has had a tradition of home ownership. Our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, and their grandparents. So that's early 1800s that we know. Both of our parents, great-great-great-grandparents also owned homes. So that's, you know, it's very important to get the oral history. And I think when you get the oral history, you'll see how important families and race, because the families generally up until this generation are Black people. And I'll never make any excuse, you know, I'm always very proud of that.
Ask me what's the button you're wearing. What's the button?
Oh, this button, thank you. This button was probably one of my first, how did you notice? Was one of the first demonstrations that I was on. I believe I was probably 10 or 11 years old. And it says, we're on the move to end slums.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. We're on the move to end slums. And this was a Louisville, these were demonstrations in Louisville. And I think it was it was either 60 or 61, 1961. And so this is an old conversation. This is nothing new. It's been happening. My dad was a vet. He was a Montford Marine. So he was also in the Korean War. So he was able to get a loan for a house when he came back. And so we've always been in that same house for 50 years, over 50 years. If we moved, we moved there in 1951. So, and we still own the house. We've learned cooperation because our family still meets on Zoom now once a month. And we talk about property values. We talk about how to do business as a family. And this is an old conversation. Our kids need to learn, you know, financial literacy. That's what it's called, financial literacy. Our families need to teach it to us because nobody else is going to do it except our families.
How did you get involved in the housing protest?
Oh, because that was what Black people were doing at the time in our neighborhood. That was a time when it was safety. We learned to cooperate. We learned to look ahead. We had civics in our classes. And all of my brothers, there are 5 of us, are all in public service. Mm-hmm. All of us. So it really does start with the foundation, and you do it one family at a time. And then you get your family into all of those public servant types of jobs like you're in, Michael, and Mr. Curtis is in. So, yeah.
So right now, the city has a lot of federal stimulus money. I think it's something like $388 in art funds. And I know that $40 million has been put in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And there's some other developments and stuff going on around housing. And I know, Michael, you work with, you're on the task force about minority contractors. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing on that task force and what the situation is with the Black businesses in Louisville.
Yes, actually, Verná is on that also, and Verná has more experience with the task force. But we have just hired a consultant to take a look at Louisville and what's needed in the community in terms of contracting, trying to get more minority, female, disabled-owned businesses certified and to get them contracts with the city. We are embarking on a disparity study. Those studies are very expensive to conduct, but we've purposed to have a study done in Louisville to help guide us in the future. Verná, you want to talk about some other activities of the task force?
Yes, well, the task force is being co-chaired by Tony Parrott of MSD and John Crockett of LG&E. And basically, we have come together. It's about 10 organizations, the two I just mentioned, Metro, Louisville Water, the Airport Authority, TARC, State Transportation Cabinet, University of Louisville, JCPS. We all sit around the table and talk about how we can be more equitable with doing business with these diverse businesses and trying to work within what we currently have in our procurement policies to be more effective with these businesses. And looking at our year-long process with the task force, we are seeing some movement in the right direction. It's been slow movement, but we're still thinking, we still feel like it's positive because we are positively getting the word out there. We are working with these small businesses, is helping them to be more engaged in the process, to be more prepared to be doing business, because it's not an easy task to do business with any of us, you know, with the paperwork process. A lot of our small businesses are small mom and pop shops, and they don't have the expertise to do the administrative side of the business. And that's where we need to come in and help them over those type of hurdles to help them to be more positive in being able to do that work. So we have a lot going for us, and we're looking forward to working with our new consultant to help us through some of these roadblocks of being more positive in this work.
Mm-hmm.
Let me also add that this is an initiative of Mayor Fisher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he did the executive order in 2020 to create your task force.
Mm-hmm.
And do you guys see a connection between the lack of the low number of small business owners and Black small business owners and housing issues too, especially some of the amenities that we lack in some of our Black communities? So.
I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence on that one. Opportunities are out there. We just have to be, I guess what you say, make people more aware of what the opportunities are for them with these programs. We don't do a good job, and we don't have marketing dollars. That's one of the big things in my department that I talk about. I don't have those marketing dollars to get out there to market the work that we do in our department. And that probably is across the board with a lot of different things. So thank you, Michael Jones, for being where you are and being able to be one of those kind of folks to help us get the word out there about the different type of opportunities. But I think a lot of it is people don't know. So we need to take more, do better about informing the people of the opportunities out there.
I would just add that our low numbers of minority, female, and disabled-owned owned businesses, that's kind of a symptom of the housing situation. You know, I think we all know that land ownership and home ownership is one of the major ways to build wealth in the United States. And if systems have been in place to prevent groups of people from land ownership and home ownership like it has, and these are not only the banking institutions, but it's also insurance, it's you know, government, you know, planning, city planning. All of those were institutions that that worked against primarily people of color to prevent them from owning property and gaining wealth. As a result, in Louisville, we've got a huge, well, all across the United States, there's a huge wealth gap. And that wealth gap has a detrimental effect on our quality of life. We're not going to open businesses. We're not going to live longer. We know that in Louisville, there's a 12-and-a-half-year gap between individuals, the life expectancy gap between individuals that live in East Louisville versus the West End. And, you know, these are things that have to be corrected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Can I just make a comment as well? Sure. One of my oldest, and it goes back, Michael Jones, to one of the things you asked, what makes a person get involved in these kinds of issues, and that is one of my earliest memories was I must have been maybe 2 years old, because my mother carried me down to a place that looked like a ghost town. So I must have been maybe 2, 3 years old again, probably not even. But it was, and what I remembered were picket fences and beautiful little garden, or big gardens, flower gardens with flowers. There were vegetable gardens. I remember picking corn. It was a ghost town. This was the houses were empty. They were neat, but they were empty. And this, she told me, was Little Africa. And everybody had been forced to leave. And of course, I was too young to understand this. But she got some flowers. She handed me flowers from it was nobody's garden, but I still to this day have some seeds from a garlic, a couple of bulbs of garlic that were labeled, and I carry them with me everywhere. This is what happens if you're not aware of if you're not passionate about where you're gonna live, or what you're gonna be, or how long you're gonna live. If you're not passionate about your quality of life, they'll take it away. I don't know who they is, but it's gonna be taken from you. That's one of my first memories, oldest memories. And it can happen again. And just like this button, you know, this is a conversation that's long in the making, and it's time. It is time. It's time. I also remember when they were building when they were taking housing away from people, that I guess is, what is it? They just take your land and say, we're getting ready to build a highway.
Or eminent domain.
Eminent domain.
Thank you, eminent domain. And they were, and those were demonstrations as well. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, well, what they're doing is they're building a road right in the middle to separate the Black community. And there's going to be the haves on that side and the have-nots on this side. And it happened. Mm-hmm. And it happened.
The area you were talking about, Little Africa, actually that was where Southwick was built. That's where they had the shanties. That area was low landing areas, and it was kind of underwater. And that's where they had the shanties that was built up on stilts. I used to play around in that area down there. And like I said, when Carter homes was built and laid on down the road when folks from Smoketown area were migrating down to the West End and for housing. Then that's where they raised and filled all the low-lying area in, and then that's where they built Southwick. Back to what Mr. Meeks was saying, we were talking about redlining, but a lot of times we like to associate redlining with property, but Mr. Meeks, when he was talking, redlining basically is everything within our lifestyle. We get redlining from groceries, where we buy our groceries, to where we buy automobiles. I mean, when you go to buy an automobile, and you could go out to Town and Country Ford, and first they won't know is your zip code that you live in, so that determines on whether or not what your interest rate is going to be. So we're redlining across the board. I don't, and then what? And what was your name, ma'am?
Renelda.
Miss Renelda. And you were talking about how your family handed down the education of wealth and ownership. See, we like to only think that education is going to school from K through 12, and then maybe possibly if you fortunate enough, maybe going on to college. But education starts from day one all the way through life. Education is just being able to live out into this world. I mean, my father, unfortunately, I was fortunate because my father was the owner of a business. I don't know if anybody might know J&H Food Bar. It was on Clay and Lambton, but he was the owner of a business. And quite naturally, he taught us all about possibly owning and being able to not only that, but getting a quality education, because the quality education goes a long way within a person's life and within the family structure. And also, we don't hand down to our children and our loved ones and family members like things were handed down to us, which you explicitly explained right there about your home ownership, how it was handed down from 1800. So we at some point in time, and that's why young people don't feel that we have anything to offer them nowadays, because they feel that we as baby boomers have failed them. And as far as the $1 billion that Mayor Fisher got back in office on by promising us Black folks that he was spending $1 billion, and that money came from the federal government, because for a simple reason, the money was slated for beach terrorists. And in order for the federal government to come in and to raise beach terrorists to where he hangs his little hang on and says that's the $1 billion he put in, a lot of people had to die in order for the federal government to come in and raise beach terrorists, because in order for that to happen, it had to be in a certain status to the federal government for them to be able to come in and say, we need to get rid of this here. So people had to die. Police pulled back. They let gangs and drugs come in. How do I know this? It's because I worked for Housing Authority during that time. I was the president of the union at that time. I knew what was going on. I had to fight to protect the people that I represented as a union president. So I knew what happened. And the same thing happened in Carter Homes when they got ready to raise Carter Homes. Same thing had happened in Southwick when they got ready to raise Southwick.
Well, we got some questions from the audience. One is, how are the panelists feeling about the West End Opportunity Partnership? What would be your advice, recommendations, or expectations of the new board?
Which board?
The West End Opportunity Partnership that's overseeing the West End TIF.
I'll believe it when I see it. I hear about it, but I haven't seen anything happen, like I say, I know they have these boards, but as far as information getting out to the masses who they are supposed to represent, seeing is believing. I haven't seen it yet, so I can't believe it.
All right, anybody else?
I'll go along with Mr. Frank and say seeing is believing. This has been a lot of work. I know going in, putting the board members together and everything, but I like the proof is in the pudding. Let's see what happens.
All right, and somebody asked you if you could talk a little more about the biggest housing related issues that are coming through the Human Relations Commission.
A lot of the housing calls that we are getting right now happen to do with property owners not being fair in housing to the clients. We get some familiar status where people are complaining about, small children and things of that sort. And then we've had a couple of cases about the income guidelines. So it's kind of spread it across the board with housing of the type of complaints we have been receiving in our office.
Okay, well, I have to close this out because we have another session following, but I wanted to give everyone opportunity to make any closing statements. Verná, do you want to go ahead and is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with?
I just would like to see that we could be more informative to our community of the availability of the different programs out there to help people be able to get through some of these areas, especially when it comes to housing and the opportunities out there. So just, us being more informative to the people.
All right. How about you, Mr. Meeks?
I'd just like to thank you for your efforts in bringing this group together. And, you've got a wonderful group of knowledgeable individuals with a lot of experience, and it has been a pleasure participating.
Yeah. And Renelda?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one statement, and that is that Little Africa was replaced by the housing developments. According to my mother, those houses in Little Africa were built and owned by the people that lived in them. The housing development were rentals. So that's one thing. And the second thing, even though I said one thing, is this has been a discussion for decades. And it's time for people to either do their business or get off the pot.
All right, thank you. And Frank, do you have any last words?
My last words are, folks, let's just get involved. Stop taking somebody else's word for what's going to happen and how they're going to dictate on how your life is going to be in the future. Get involved, find out where the meetings are going to be. Go to the meetings, participate in the meetings. Let your fingers do the walking. If you don't have a computer, you got telephones that are computers. Find out where the money is and find out the people that are going to be representing you, whether or not they're going to give you fair representation or whether or not they're in it just for themselves.
Okay, and thank everyone for joining us. And I would like to say that these oral histories are going to be available at the UofL Oral History Center. And there might be some publication in the future from Metro Housing Coalition. And I'm also doing a cover story about affordable housing in Louisville Business First on May 18th. And so hopefully all of this will help the community conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting everyone.
You too.
Thank you, everybody, as well. Thanks to the panelists, for session one, not only for participating in this panel, but also for being a part, like Michael said, of the UofL Unfair Housing Louisville Oral History Project. And we'll make sure that a link is available to those oral histories when they are available. And we're going to take a couple minutes here and switch over to our next panel. So if you are on session 2, you can go ahead and start your videos and we'll momentarily move into that. So just give us a second to switch over panels here. Okay, I think we have everybody on here, so we'll go ahead and move into session 2, which will be a discussion on fair housing policy in both Louisville and across the state. And I will, at this point, we'll have about an hour for this session as well. So please, just a reminder that everybody can put questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box, preferably the Q&A, it's easier to track. But hopefully for a good discussion here on some things that came out of the first session and what's going on in the fair housing policy world. So I will I will mute myself here and I will turn over everything to Heather Fox, who's the director of the UofL Oral History Center at the University of Louisville, and she will take us from here. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. We have Shay Lamarr, who is joining us from the Lexington Fair Housing Council, where she is a programs coordinator. Our next panelist is Nima Kulkarni, who is an American immigration attorney and a Democratic member of the Kentucky House of Representatives, representing District 40 since January 2019. And last but not least, Nicole George, who was elected to represent the people of District 21 on the Louisville Metro Council. In 2022, she serves as chair of the Metro Council's Public Works Committee. She's also a member of the Planning and Zoning, Equity and Inclusion and Budget Committees. So welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have you here. And I wanted to start off with a question for Shay, if you don't mind. So in your work with fair housing, I was wondering, what are sort of the main issues that are coming across your desk? What are the things that you're mostly dealing with right now?
Well, the largest sum of our calls usually involve disability claims. However, we do get a lot of race. Source of income is a huge thing right now, given the new protections in Louisville. So all of those things are, really relevant issues right now.
And a more general question to our legislators. Could you talk about what is the current policy discussion on fair housing policy at both the local and the state level? And where do you see these conversations focusing in the future? And thank you for being here. I'll let
I don't know if we're going first. I'll just jump in.
Okay.
Thank you, first of all, for having me. I was able to sit in on the prior panels. Super informative and just really fascinating discussion. And I think it's going to frame a lot of the things that we talk about now. And one of the things I will say on a state level, when we're talking about fair housing, a lot of the discussion has been around landlord and tenant rights and obligations. And we saw there was a huge issue with evictions and people simply losing their homes because of the pandemic, because of economic losses and loss of jobs, loss of wages, and not enough of a safety net to withstand that. And so a lot of the discussion has been around renters rather than homeowners. But of course, in my opinion, we have to look at all of those issues together in a holistic way, because we want to move everybody towards homeownership. As I know several of the prior panel members mentioned, it is an asset. It is the vast majority of Americans' most valuable asset. And so moving people into home ownership should be a priority and a goal for everyone in the legislature.
Councilmember George.
Thank you. And I'm very honored to be here today and want to thank you guys for providing a forum for such an important conversation. I would say at the local level, lots of effort has been focused around really looking at one, just, how do we encourage a more housing period, in addition to looking at how do you inspire more housing options. And as many of you guys were obviously very connected with land development reform from last year, we know we still have work to do to break down some of the barriers that currently exist with our LDC policies, and particularly as it relates to how do you inspire more multifamily, how do you inspire more housing types, thinking about accessory dwelling units. And so I would say more housing in general, expanded housing types through reforms with LTC. And then last but not least, I would say, and as everyone is familiar, we passed the ordinance around fair housing last year. And for anyone who didn't have an opportunity to see last week's Equity and Inclusion Subcommittee, I would encourage you to go back to watch that, simply because I think there's a lot to be learned around ways that our fair housing policy isn't working, and what opportunities exist to address some of the challenges that we're still seeing.
We have a question in the chat here. I heard someone speak recently about Louisville's lack of a certain type of housing, mixed use or middle use. If anyone knows what I'm referring to, could you define it and speak to its relevance? And Tony suggests that it may be missing middle housing. So does that relate to what you're talking about, Councilwoman George?
It does. And so when we think about missing middle, we often think about things like duplexes. I think that was, post World War II, there were several, particularly in District 21, developments around duplexes. We also know we're talking about things like accessory dwelling units. So those are your granny flats or your carriage houses that are in backyards, or they can be attached to or connected with a property, I should say. The other piece that, and this has recently come to my attention, is opportunities for multi-generational living, like Nesterly. You guys are probably very familiar with that application. I recently learned about it. And of course, what it does is it allows for opportunities. If you have say you're aging and you have a big home, the ability to, have someone come live with you who's able to maybe exchange rent for services, I should say. And that through Nesterly, they have strong matches that are made, so ideally, so that people have a good match on the front end and that they're able to supplement whatever they can't pay in rent with services. Currently, our policies, in particular on what constitutes a boarding house, create some barriers to that type of housing model. But again, when I think of with missing middle, I think of duplexes, I think of accessory dwelling units, and I think of intergenerational living models for things like, example, Nesterly.
Thank you. Do either of the other panelists want to have anything to add to that conversation about missing middle housing or alternative forms of housing?
One of the things that fair housing is very interested in is changing some of our zoning rules. As Councilwoman George mentioned, some of the definitions can restrict access to housing. We see this especially in single family use zones. So that's also one of the things that we would like to see as far as making housing more accessible would be to start seeing those zoning measures changed, and the potential to add multifamily units and affordable housing throughout the city. That way it isn't all just clustered into one section of the population.
And I'll just echo that in terms of zoning and the importance of how we're using existing property. I know certainly in my district there are vacant properties, there is just unused land in little pockets here and there, and I'm in Louisville, so it's not like I have just acres of land, but there are pockets of unused property that could be developed, and again, it should be in a way that's a little bit more innovative than just a single family home, because we have a real shortage of housing stock and we are not being deliberate enough. I think I'm certain that the Metro Council is looking at this very closely, but I think it needs state help as well in innovation and a lot of partnership because of the funding need in order to look at where does the money go and is it going to the right people in terms of sustainability and long-term planning for things like intergenerational housing, because you've got a lot of people that want to stay in their same communities. You've got a lot of immigrant families where they don't want to live in assisted family or centers or anywhere outside of their family homes. And you're going to need to look at that very closely as we get into aging concerns, as we get into health concerns. So this is, again, something that we've got to look at very holistically in terms of what's best for our communities.
Thank you. And what are you all hearing from your constituents in regard to fair housing issues or barriers to housing? And I'll call on Councilwoman George.
Thank you. I would say the primary thing that I hear of the most, and bear in mind the council district that I serve is one where you have older housing stock that is often, smaller homes, densely populated area. And from that, I hear a lot about the need for quality housing. I hear a lot about conditions and concerns with predatory investors and quite frankly, just lack of investment overall that prevents quality of living as well as person investment, meaning we see a lot of people, and I have lots of blocks where I hear from neighbors and they'll say, as soon as I can get out of here, as soon as I can get the money, I'm moving. And so why that's a problem for the overall neighborhoods is that, of course, then you have people who are less invested because they're planning to move. And oftentimes that's based on where they can find other affordable housing. And so that means they may not be guaranteed to stay on the same, block or neighborhood. And so I guess I would say the primary thing that I hear most about is quality of housing. I also hear a lot about vacant housing, just to kind of speak to a little bit about what Representative Kulkarni spoke. In District 21, oh my goodness, and I'm trying to think how many years ago it was, probably 8 years ago, we had a 9% vacant property rate. And I would venture to say, despite a good market, that stayed consistent. And so really being able to work with property owners as they age to address home repairs and make appropriate plans for their properties once they transition on is really important. And where we see major gaps and where I hear lots of concerns from neighbors is around what happens when those houses sit vacant for a long period of time. Then you have someone come in to invest, the repairs are not done well, someone comes to move in, and of course the quality of housing is not only an equity issue, but can also be a safety issue. And we see that not just with single family housing, although I certainly have a lot of experience working with single family vacant properties. We also see this in major housing complexes. So we have several large apartment complexes in the area that I serve, and a portion of them are either in just deplorable conditions or they're vacant. A large section of them will be vacant, and so and have been vacant for years. So all that to say, I would say the most I hear about is quality of living and standards within the housing units.
Representative Kulkarni.
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what Councilwoman George was mentioning. I will say that the biggest issue I have heard about is access to housing. And I live near my district encompasses the University of Louisville and Churchill Downs and parts of South Louisville as well right now. But one of the things that I've noticed is the same thing. As people get older, they move out of their homes. I live right by the university, so a lot of them are being purchased. These homes are being purchased and then rented out to students. which is fine, but it's a question of, again, how well are they being maintained? Who is the person now owning the property? Do they even live in the state? Which a lot of times they don't. They just buy chunks of property, they buy blocks, and are, you know, cutting corners in terms of their margins and making sure it's just habitable. And again, it's just for students, so who really cares kind of mentality, right, in terms of wear and tear and how well these homes are being maintained. I will also say that younger people who are looking to purchase homes, moving from renting to buying homes, are not able to do so. Right. We can look at, even in my neighborhood, simply because of the proximity to the university, home prices are going up. So if you wanted to purchase a home, it's hard to find, because most of them are rentals now. Second of all, even if you could find a home, it's going to be way out of your price range. It's difficult for young people to just save up enough or just have on hand enough for let's say a down payment, or for fixing up or renovating homes that do need foundational work, for instance. But we are not doing enough to move people from renting, if they want to, into property ownership. And part of that is also what happens when they are renting. I filed several pieces of legislation, again, dealing with the landlord-tenant issue, because the narrative became landlord versus tenant. And it was very unproductive and very damaging, because policies were being enacted or not enacted based on this feeling that renters are somehow not as invested in their communities as homeowners. And so you're not helping them move forward on that path to homeownership, as though they're just going to remain renters for the rest of their lives, A, because of access to capital, B, because of little to no housing stock in certain neighborhoods. But also this idea of, are you a good renter? Are you a good enough renter to where, if a company is looking to provide you with a mortgage, are they going to be looking at your credit score? Are they looking at your credit history? Do you have an eviction on your record, which, even if it wasn't actually an eviction judgment, simply a landlord filing against you stays on your record forever? And I have a bill to expunge those records, but right now in Kentucky, that's not the law. Same with set outs, like constructive evictions versus legal evictions. All of that plays into, are you a viable candidate for someone to loan you money to purchase a home? And so that is all together, one issue bleeding into the other, because people then don't feel like they're part of their communities. They're just going to rent and then maybe live somewhere else if they can, or just keep renting and not really have a vested interest in where they're staying, because they don't see a path forward. And become more and more jaded about the whole thing. And we know, of course, undergirding all of this is the student loan debt crisis. There's a lot of people that are graduating that not just graduating, but that have graduated and have jobs and have good paying, careers, that are still unable because they have to pay off their student debts to do things, basic things that, for instance, prior generations took for granted. You can buy a home, you start a family. That's the next step in life. And these generations coming up are simply not able to do that. And we are not changing our policies or looking at our policies in a way that would help them to benefit from that same generational wealth growth that prior generations have seen.
Thank you. I want to turn to Shay now. What are some of the most common challenges faced by the tenants that you work with? And do you have some examples that you can share with our attendees?
Well, I have to agree with both the other panelists here, that there are a lot of issues surrounding the changing dynamics, people's ages, investment in community. Our biggest challenge that we see is affordability and availability. According to, I think it's Louisville Office of Housing, they did a needs assessment for the state of housing, and they determined that there was only 46% of housing available to take care of our lowest income individuals. And they determined that there's a lack of over 31,000 units. So that's something, of course, that we try to mitigate in fair housing, trying to provide resources for individuals, try to overcome, the systemic barriers that they face. The source of income protections go a long way to helping us in our mission to make that housing more available. However, there's still obviously a long way to go.
Could you talk a little bit more about the source of income protections for people in the audience who might not fully understand how you might protect one's income? Yeah.
Yes. So Louisville has enacted multiple protections. They added several categories to the protected classes. So one of the things that people are now protected from is a history of homelessness, their veteran status, and another thing is their source of income. So if a person receives income from child support, or they have income in the form of a Section 8 voucher, they can't be denied housing based on those, based on having that voucher or any source of income. So it really levels the playing field as far as giving people an equal opportunity to have access to housing. Because even if an apartment is quote unquote affordable, there are a lot of regulations in place, for individual complexes or landlords that stipulate who can rent and who can't. So if you don't make 3 times the market rate rent, they may not want to rent to you. And those source of income protections come in handy because at that point, a person is only responsible for making 3 times their portion of the voucher. So if their portion, for example, is 0, they would only be responsible for making 3 times 0. So, so that goes a long way in increasing that access, in providing that extra support from the state. And it keeps housing providers accountable for the upkeep that we see difficulty with. A lot of times, historically, people have refused Section 8 vouchers because they cannot pass the inspections, which are really basic code inspections. So chances are if a house can't pass a Section 8 inspection, then they wouldn't be able to pass one by code enforcement. So the idea is that this spurs individuals to take more care of their property and be ready for those Section 8 inspections because they may get somebody at their door that says, I have a voucher. You can't deny that person just because they have that voucher. So so it does provide a lot of support in the housing industry to have those protections in place.
And they do prove to be successful.
Yes. We have gone through a sort of transitional period this past year where we focused on education, educating housing providers about the new protections. When we get reports of individuals, maybe not taking vouchers, we make efforts to, provide training and do some outreach and educate them about, the new laws and encourage them to change their policies. So, so all of those things, play together to create, better housing availability for everyone and more sustainable housing as well.
Can we now talk a little bit about people who can't find housing with a Section 8 voucher? So what can we do to decrease barriers to finding safe and stable housing in that instance?
That is a very good question.
And I'm opening that to all 3 of you.
So one thing I wanted to mention, and I see that Director Goatley is with us. I think Shay brings up some really good points about what the council was able to do in the way of expanded protections. But I also want to be clear to say that I do think there are still some existing gaps. And I know that, again, when Director Goatley and her staff came to present before Equity and Inclusion last week, they mentioned several of those. And quite frankly, I think there's some additional conversation to be had about the rent to income ratios, in addition to what we're seeing come before the Human Rights Commission related with claims and complainants. And I don't want to speak to that because I feel like that's outside my role, but I just want to be fair to say on the front end that we still have some work to do The other thing that I hear in the community is we do have community members who have vouchers and for whom there are not the housing options. And so this goes back to how we started the panel with really talking about the need to expand housing, both in the way of units available, as well as creating a variety of housing types.
Were you going to say, Representative Kulkarni, did I see you? Okay. Let's see, there's a comment in the Q&A from Kathy Hinko. Much of the anti-renter feeling is race/ethnicity based, and we need to face that we judge people by the content of their contract, lease or mortgage, instead of the content of their character. Why don't we add a requirement to all committees, commissions that deal with land use, housing, and other related issues? I bet that most of these members are homeowners, but in Louisville, 88% of all homeowners are white. Do any panelists want to respond to that?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, yes, I agree. And that's certainly where the impact is. You know, we're talking about people that aren't able necessarily or willing to purchase a home for whatever reason. But frankly, a lot of it boils down to they cannot because of all the reasons that we've talked about. And Louisville has a very sad history of segregation, geographic segregation. We, you know, everyone here has probably heard about redlining. And I mean, it's still happening in certain ways, in the ways that we deny access to people to purchase homes and to become homeowners. And I think one of the things I always go back to, I mean, somebody brought up, I think, the West End Opportunity Partnership. And I'm just going to use that as sort of a framework because it utilizes a TIF, which is a tax increment financing, which is primarily used for development. And so developers, it's an incentive for developers to come into an area and build it up. And unless you have some really, really strong safeguards built into that, I voted against the legislation simply because there wasn't enough in there. There wasn't enough to safeguard making sure that individuals in those communities in the West End were actually being invested in. And I know that the board has met, but I think the appointees from the 9 neighborhoods are still not confirmed. And so I'm just very curious and frankly skeptical of the entire scenario when you are not incorporating the viewpoints and the perspectives and the voices of the people in the 9 neighborhoods that you're saying that you want to invest in, that you're trying to get developers to come in and build up. And yet you're not willing to listen to them and haven't even appointed those board members. And that is emblematic in terms of how we've treated residents of the West End, in terms of how we treat low income neighborhoods, whether it's West End, and this happens in South Louisville as well, where you just don't have the priority given that you do in the East End. For instance, in terms of who's going where and building that housing stock that we're talking about, who is allowing for new homes to be built, who is allowing for homes to be maintained, or, you know, for homes that need to be gutted and renovated and rehabilitated, who is doing that? That kind of investment is not happening. And so when you bring up a bill saying that we need to raise all this money to invest in a specific area of town, where is that money actually going and who is it benefiting? Those questions are perennial because they are never answered to the satisfaction of housing advocates and frankly, the community members who live there. And it's happening today. So this idea of this geographic segregation and access to housing and equal access to housing and opportunity of home ownership is still not true. And we are, again, as policymakers, not doing enough because we are viewing them. We're viewing people that rent homes as somehow lesser than people who are able to buy homes. And again, that happens a lot because you may have family members who are able to use their own homes as collateral to secure your down payment. You have this idea of generational wealth that it exists in families that simply does not exist for certain communities. And we are not doing anything to address that on a state level because we're simply not talking about it in this way on a state level. And I think one thing that has shifted a little bit, at least in the past couple of sessions, is that the pandemic has thrown everything, every single disparity out there into very stark relief. And so people in Eastern Kentucky are having the same issues that people in the west end of Jefferson County are having. And so all of a sudden, everybody's in the same boat in terms of losing their jobs, losing their incomes, losing their security, losing their homes. And so I'm hopeful that we can move that conversation a little bit forward in terms of just making things a little bit more fair, a little bit more equal, because it's going to take, I think, an entire generational shift for this to really change in our lifetimes.
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
I would just say in response to Kathy's question, anti-renter sentiment, and particularly what I hear in the South End, is often misplaced and often, yes, driven by racism. But at the same time, I think we have to be honest that it is in response to a real issue. And that real issue involves disinvestment from property owners who come in, again, many of them not living in the state, purchasing a property, barely putting enough into it to make it livable, and then moving people in to then somehow have to continue to keep up the property that is falling in around them. And so I think oftentimes we have to be honest about the complexities of our current rental landscape and housing stock, in addition to the lack of, quite frankly, code enforcement and property maintenance, and how oftentimes within the community, it can translate into anti-renter sentiment that is not necessarily driven by an understanding of it's not the person living in the property, but all the things that go around the property. And that is to say, who's invested or chosen not to invest, what their stake is in that, because of course they're collecting rent every month, or ideally collecting rent every month. And that property is not being maintained at the level that community members who've lived there for many years have seen. And so again, I just want to say, I think it is a little more complicated, and particularly when we think about not just the response to what folks see, but seeing beyond who's living in the property to understanding who owns the property and what their responsibility is.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have another question, and this is for you, Councilwoman George, and possibly our other panelists. How does the community conversation around Louisville's land development code have a chance to decrease barriers to housing? How might that have an impact?
Well, I think first of all, education, I've had a big learning curve with land use being in this role, and it can be very cumbersome and intimidating for many community members to dig into. And so I think it's really incumbent upon Metro to find better ways to first educate on what the Code of Ordinances does say and what the Land Development Code says. And I think about, currently and I know Lexington, Shay is in the same boat, where they expanded opportunities around accessory dwelling units. Now we're trying to really get out in the community with the help of many partners, as part of this panel, to get out and educate on here's the ease in which an ADU, particularly for an ADU when you live on the property, can be built, and having extended those by right. And it is really difficult to communicate around, and again, not something that historically local government has done well. I think the other thing to think about is being able to engage community members on the front end. When we did our last round of land development reforms, I want to say, I think planning and design did a tremendous job with what they had available to them. But of course it was during the pandemic. And so you had a lot of virtual meetings. There were some boots on the ground attempts to meet people where they were in parks. But again, those pieces are still limited. And so all that to say, I think there's obviously the need for stronger communication, stronger engagement around, what opportunities exist. And I think we're going to see that with upcoming reform efforts. As everyone is aware, there was multiple reports that have come out that have driven much of the reform efforts, and they're being, done in phases. And as part of those phases, obviously last year's, we chose to look at expanding notifications, not just to property owners, but renters. It's a big deal to make sure that we're making attempts to the residents who live in the homes when they learn of a zoning change coming before the council or the planning commission and then the council. We looked at an array of pieces with setbacks. And of course, these are just kind of low-hanging fruit items that, you know, as we move into the next phase, we're going to need strong engagement and strong communication to be able to really hear from the community on what's needed and what the potential opportunities are.
Shay, do you have anything to add to that?
No, it was beautifully spoken.
Representative Kulkarni?
No, I'll echo Shay.
Okay, so looking at other cities and states, what fair housing policies and practices might we look to implement in Louisville and across Kentucky, and what might have the biggest impact? Shay, I'll start with you. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. So in Louisville, there is the Landlord-Tenant Act. That's something that we would like to see statewide as far as advancing protections. In Louisville specifically, there are other protections in other places. California has some interesting ones. They do marital status, domestic violence status specifically, and several others. But I would say that those would be some very simple ones for us to, you know, always add in. The more protections, the more people that we can serve. But I would say the strengthening the Landlord-Tenant Act, giving giving tenants more rights and protections. Right now, there is a lot in the act that is more geared toward protecting landlords. Not a lot of recourse for tenants who do have problems. And
well, your audio cut out. You're still mute. Let's see. You want to try again? No, we lost you for some reason.
Okay, go on with
no, now you're back.
Okay. Okay, I'm so sorry. I have no clue what happened. I'm still working on technology. But I think that I was saying something about just expanding protections for tenants. There's very little recourse for them if they do have issues. Mm-hmm. And just making those small changes. As I said, the more protections that we have for people, the better. The more equitable housing can be. And I think that's all I have to add.
Thank you. Looks like Michael Meeks in the chat, he agrees with you. It may be time to modify the Kentucky Landlord-Tenant Act to make it more tenant-friendly.
And I did file a bill for that. I think I filed it the past couple of sessions. I will note that it is in dire need of updating. The Landlord-Tenant Act was adopted in the 70s. And in Kentucky, there's only a handful of counties that have opted in. It's an opt-in situation. Jefferson County is one of them. But I don't know how many others. It is very small. I mean, I don't know exactly the number of counties, 7 to 10 counties maybe. That it's that low. And so and it's not been updated. And so the revised Uniform Landlord-Tenant Act would address some of the changes that have happened, obviously, since the 70s. It has expanded protections for domestic violence situations, interpersonal violence situations. And it, strengthens or tries to strengthen a little bit more in terms of tenant protections. But the main thing is that it clearly lays out what the rights and obligations of both landlords and tenants are. And that is something that I think both landlords and tenants need to get behind, because it would reduce liability for both. I know that it increases notice provisions for set outs, which was a separate bill that I filed, but if this passed, it would just be part of it. And And it does not address expungements necessarily, eviction record expungements, but you can modify that. So it's a uniform law, which means there's a uniform law commission in this country that tries to make laws consistent across the states. And so this is one of them. And the idea being, of course, that you don't have different laws applied differently in different states, or even within counties in one state as we have currently in Kentucky. So I have had good conversations, bipartisan conversations about this issue, mainly because it is a uniform law, and that commission is trusted by lawmakers for the most part. Right. And I'm hopeful that that conversation will be moved forward in the interim and can be then used to craft legislation that is uniform, but also modified to address the needs of Kentucky specifically.
How much support were you getting in the House for that?
So there were conversations, individual conversations, not necessarily with leadership in the House, but with some of the leadership in the Senate. So it's a lot of different people that are interested in this. Again, I think mainly because we could see disparities emerge all throughout the 120 counties in Kentucky, not just between urban and rural, not just in Eastern Kentucky, not just in Jefferson County. So landlord-tenant protections, I think, is something everyone sees as very low-hanging fruit. Right. And we should be working towards enacting those types of policies as soon as possible.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to that, or shall we move on?
Well, I was just going to say, from a local perspective, first of all, I want to encourage everyone to reach out to council members. We depend on you to largely influence to hear what are other cities doing and what should we be doing that works as part of what we're learning. Kathy Hinko, I know asked a question about having a requirement that for boards and commissions involving housing, that there be a certain percentage of renters. And I think that's a great idea. That's not something that I thought of. And so that's just an example of what I'm talking about when you guys approach council members. I think two pieces that are important that warrant further exploration that have potential from other cities. The one involves proactive property maintenance inspections for rentals, rather than, as it currently exists, property maintenance inspections are, unless you're Section 8, they are just complaint driven. And so they're reactive and somewhat arbitrary, to be perfectly honest. And so thinking about ways to inspire a system that is more proactive with inspections to ensure adequate housing standards is important. And the second piece that goes along with that is what I understand to be essentially rental escrow accounts in other cities, where if you're a resident and you find yourself in deplorable conditions and you don't want to pay the landlord, you also don't want to be evicted, the opportunity to pay into a locally managed rental escrow account that then that money could go to that, and then again, not paying your rent wouldn't count against you and toward an eviction. Those two potential areas that I know have been seen to work in other cities really warrant further exploration here.
We have a question in the chat. What have your conversations been like with fellow legislators around your URLTA legislation filing? What are the barriers to updating URLTA?
So a lot of the barriers were about why are we helping tenants? This is just sort of going back to the whole conversation that turned into landlord versus tenant throughout the state, and the recognition finally that there are people that rent outside of Jefferson County that I think has moved some of this forward. I don't think people are aware necessarily of exactly what the law does, how it could help their constituents, and why it's urgent. I think everybody now recognizes just there's a housing crisis on whatever level exists in their own counties, whether it's evictions, whether it is not enough housing stock, whether it is seniors not able to maintain their homes, and what do we do to help them age safely. whether in their homes or in a community that is able to keep them safe and secure. So all of these issues are being discussed now. And I think that having, again, low-hanging fruit in terms of just what landlord rights and obligations are and what tenant obligations and rights are, is some low-hanging fruit that we can talk about in a very bipartisan way, because it helps everybody. It helps people that own property that are renting, and it helps people that are renting and forward. And so I think I've had conversations both in the House and the Senate with some traction. I think some of that fervor about or division about landlord versus tenant has died down a little bit. And so I'm hopeful for a bit more rational discussion. Really practical discussions is what I'm hoping for in the interim, in terms of, does anything in the uniform law need to change, or can we adopt it as is? Do we want to keep the opt-in model? And if so, what are we as a state going to do to educate counties to see whether or not they want to adopt and why they should? And so that kind of sort of practical next steps is what I'm hopeful for in the interim, which will start here in June. So I encourage anyone on this call, anyone interested in this issue, certainly reach out to me. Reach out to your own senators and representatives, but I'm happy to facilitate meetings or conversations if you want to do it as a group, because I think they need to understand that they have constituents that want to see this bill outside of Kentucky. It can't just be seen as a Jefferson County issue. And so that's what I'm hoping to sort of, really impress upon my colleagues in the State House.
Thank you. So speaking of partnerships, what housing justice partnerships exist at the local and state level that you think citizens need to be engaged with? And maybe Shay, should I start with you? Do you have?
So this is a question about resources?
Yes, housing justice partnerships at the local and state level.
Okay. So I would say we do a lot of work on the ground, not necessarily at the same table with legislators per se. We're the ones on the ground sort of pushing the work, raising the awareness, and encouraging everyone to reach out to their local legislators and etc. We do work closely with the governor's office. That's probably the one exception. And we get a lot of referrals through there. And it does seem that as far as a partnership, that there is an understanding that, fair housing is, of course, a big issue in the state of Kentucky, and that there's a desperate need for more resources. So as far as partnerships, we rely on one another to keep the other informed and to make those resources available to all Kentuckians.
Thank you. Representative Kulkarni, I think I cut you off. I apologize.
No, I don't think you did.
Okay.
I will just add to that. So we have a lot of resources in Louisville, specifically for Jefferson County. I'm assuming that Fayette County probably does as well. On a state level, there is an affordable housing caucus that was recently created. It is bipartisan, bicameral, so there's Senate and House members, there's Democrats and Republicans that are interested in this issue. And so I think that is a good vehicle for people to reach out to, and this is public information. So if you go to the LRC website, it's lrc.ky.gov, you can look at all the statutory committees, you can look at interim committees, and you can also see the different caucuses that exist. And so that's where you would find the Affordable Housing Caucus and their membership. And it might be worth looking at, any of those folks represent anyone you know? But also just to reach out to them as a caucus, as a group of people interested, obviously self-selected, interested in affordable housing and generally probably the housing issue. So that is encouraging that exists on a state level. And I think it's something that we should certainly utilize and advocates should certainly utilize since that's their purpose in in educating them about what resources are available and what we already know we should be doing for our individual communities. So I would start there, know who your own representatives and senators are, and then look at the folks in that group specifically for housing issues.
Thank you. Councilmember George, do you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. Let's see what we have here in the chat. Here's in the Q&A, Kathy Hinko says, yes, Councilmember George, homes should be like restaurants, health and safety. Heck, children are much more affected on a daily basis by housing than a restaurant. So, do we have any other questions from the audience or comments?
There was another question, and I typed in a response and it went away.
Oh, shoot.
It was about a vacancy. It was about a property tax for vacant properties.
Okay. Tony Curtis, do you have access to that question? Oh, I found it. So I'll just read it out. The mechanisms behind building new affordable housing tend to be related to stipulations attached to funding sources for developers, like with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. What do you all think about a vacancy tax like implemented in Vancouver to potentially drive down rent prices, discourage empty housing stock, and supplement funds to be used by Louisville Metro for affordable housing? And I see that Councilwoman George, you generally support the idea of a vacancy property tax, but we need to learn more.
Yes, I said I would need to learn more. Some of you guys could probably educate me because I thought at some point Louisville had something like that. So I think there's a little bit of history to be learned that, quite frankly, I don't have. But in general, yes, that seems like a good strategy. And I like the idea of having something directed back to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, here's one. Yes, even the recently contested MRDI is a way to give a benefit that has monetary impact without actually giving money by flexibility and density without violating the density limit, but more exist. Let me see. Looking at the chat. Okay. I believe I've received one more question. A lot of barriers exist in the power dynamic between landlords and tenants on eviction court. How do we create more equity in eviction court proceedings?
Currently, as it stands in eviction court, there's no real burden of proof that takes place. So if we could, institute that, I think that would lead to that would heal a lot of the power imbalance that we see in court if physical proof and evidence were more highly sought after, rather than just a landlord coming in, filling out the proper documentation, and the tenant having no ability to have a proper defense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'll add that, I completely agree. There is no right to counsel, which I think Louisville has recently enacted. I think, was it this year or last year, maybe, in eviction proceedings, which is huge in my opinion.
Wow.
You need to have advocates because there's a lot of people who don't understand the process. I know I have seniors in my district who have faced eviction that had no idea what notices were being sent to them, did not know how to respond, ended up being evicted, and their property just taken away. And they don't know that. If you can think about it, if you've lived somewhere for any extended period of time, all your stuff is gone and you have no recourse as an individual to get it back. This could be family heirlooms, et cetera, which are worthless to anyone else but you. But also this idea that Shay talked about, that a landlord could just file an eviction. Mm-hmm. And it's just on your record forever. And so the bill that I introduced that I will be pushing for also in the next session, it would basically seal from public record an eviction filing unless it results in a judgment. And in the case of judgment, it would be on record for a year and then be sealed again. So it doesn't just stay on your record forever. It does stay it does get put on your record if there's an actual judgment. So it's a little bit of protection. But advocacy, having a right to an attorney in an eviction proceeding is huge. Not having frivolous filings by landlords or unjustified filings by landlords, or just filings that didn't go anywhere that were ultimately dismissed or withdrawn by a landlord, should not remain on a renter's record on any level. I think those two things are really, really important, but I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having someone who knows the process or understands the process, be able to advise somebody, because, you know, as we saw in the pandemic, we had eviction hearings over Zoom, which I can't imagine, if you're not technologically savvy, if you don't have access to internet, if you don't have access to good working internet that's stable, right. I mean, and you're just getting evicted. And there was a moratorium for a while for against evictions for non-payment of rent. But what we saw were that the evictions were being filed. They just simply weren't being acted on until that moratorium was lifted. And then all of them were able to be acted upon all at once. And so it really resulted in a crisis that did not need to happen in that way. But it did not stop evictions for any other number of reasons, whether they were justified or not, from being filed. So I think those simple policies like that, just recognizing the inequities in the process and the procedure, and recognizing also the complexities of that process and the need for proper notice, very clear notice, availability of counsel, or at least some help in what this process looks like is vital to making sure that people have some knowledge or understanding of what's happening to them.
Absolutely agree 100%. I think you also made a good point when you discussed how this isn't just a short-term incident, right? You don't just get evicted and go and find another house and start all over. That eviction stays with you and it's carried by you for the rest of your life. And can absolutely impact your housing choices, in the future. We find a lot of people who have experienced evictions tend to be more at risk for renting substandard housing, because that's all that they can find. That's the only people willing to work with them, essentially, possibly preying on them, knowing the vulnerability of their situation. So creating measures to mitigate the damage that eviction causes definitely, I believe, will have a profound impact on the community.
Both those responses were really well said. So I don't know that I have much to contribute other than just wanting to underscore that in addition to burden of proof, what I saw during the pandemic, quite frankly, was that lack of strong communication on the front end that said, it's important for you to go or to attend. And I understand the limitations, obviously, with Zoom. But I think for a lot of at least the neighbors that I spoke with, they feel so overwhelmed and like it's kind of hopeless, and they don't, I think it's intimidating in general to think about, the system. And so for all those reasons, even during the moratorium, when, they could go, and of course, as part of Metro and Marilyn Harris's team, there was the provision to be able to pull folks out and make those payments. They still weren't going, or, and again, to Representative Kulkarni's point, counsel's available, but you have to know that that's available and you have to reach out, I believe. And so those barriers, I think, are just fundamental low-hanging fruit before you even get to the burden of proof piece.
And I'll just add that I volunteered in eviction court watch a little bit during 2020 in the pandemic, sort of watching the Zoom eviction court. So it is terrible. I mean, just the way that just seeing people that, as you say, maybe have a crappy phone with crappy internet, and then the sort of, I don't know, kind of unrelenting, unsympathetic view of the court, right? Where it was just like burn it through. Yeah. So thank you all for doing the work that you're doing. It looks like we're headed towards the end of our session. I have a final question, and then we'll move to concluding remarks. Where do you see the fair housing policy debate moving in the coming months and years?
I say we have more protections now than we had in the past, and that number continues to grow. So I have a lot of faith that the fair housing conversation is going to continue to evolve and be a real, like a real crux of the affordable housing movement. Yeah.
Councilwoman George.
Sorry, I got caught up in reading the chat, which is really important. So yeah, I mean, I think what I spoke to before about moving in the direction in the future, I do think in Louisville particularly, we're learning about the gaps that currently exist within the Fair Housing Ordinance. And I think hopefully being able to expand some of those protections as we move forward will be on the radar. I think the second piece to this is really being able to look at how do you ensure quality housing and understanding the relationship between safe and quality housing and perception in the community around renters and being able to also inspire those who are renting to remain in the community rather than, again, for a lot of my neighbors, the conditions are such that as soon as they do have a little bit of extra income, they plan to move. And so we want to make sure that people are staying in the community, feel at home, and are inspired to have longer roots.
And I'll just add that I'm also encouraged, whatever silver lining this pandemic may have, I think it's shown that most of us are in the same boat. For a variety of reasons. And I think that coalition building is going to be imperative if we're going to move forward with any actual policy, because people need to feel like they are each other's keeper, that they should be taking care of their neighbors, that communities matter. And I think that we are stronger for it. And I think that recognition is a little bit broader. In the past, at least legislatively in the past couple of sessions, we're having more conversations about housing. We're having more conversations about equity, about access, about opportunity. These words are being used a lot more than I've ever heard them in Frankfurt. And I think that speaks to again, at least the possibility of a shift towards recognizing that housing is a fundamental human right, and that our state and our government, our local and state, national, any level of government, any elected official, any policies that we have are there to help people. We've recognized that the safety nets that we had in place were just not enough, were not sufficient, were easily broken, and people were falling consistently through the cracks, and they're going to keep doing that for the foreseeable future as our economy recovers for some. So whether or not that's equitable is a whole other discussion. But I do think in terms of just people having a roof over their head, having a roof over their kids' head, we can see how that bleeds into your ability to get a job, to keep a job, to get your kids to school, to feed your family, to make sure your parents are medicated, make sure that they have access to healthcare. All of these things are tied into you being able to open the door somewhere where your belongings are safe, where you're safe, and lock the door behind you. And I think that is that recognition of the importance of that for everybody is something that we need to capitalize on. It's a recognition that has not always been there for everyone. And so I think as advocates, as a community, we need to make sure that we keep talking about these issues, because as we have seen in this brief discussion, there are so many different nuances and wrinkles and policies that we can implement for so many different gaps that exist in our housing structures, infrastructures, and policies. And I think that we really need to be pushing hard, pushing elected officials hard, pushing each other hard to say, what is the best practice that we can implement, whether it's from a neighboring state, whether it's just a great idea somebody comes up with. We need to be looking at ways to do things better, faster, much more sustainably than we have looked at in the past, because there will be another crisis, and we need to make sure that everybody in our community is able to weather it and come out on the other side together.
Thank you so much. We just got a note in the chat, very thoughtful discussion of difficult issues. Thanks to all participants. And I echo that comment. I'm going to turn it back over to Tony for closing remarks, but I want to thank all three of our panelists for joining us today and for all the work you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Kulkarni, Councilwoman George, and Shay for having such a great and in-depth discussion of fair housing policy. It's a very important conversation to have, not only during Fair Housing Month, but moving forward in each of our daily lives. But thank you to all of our attendees for attending, and to our sponsors again of this, to the Lexington Fair Housing Council, the Coalition for the Homeless, the League of Women Voters, and the University of Louisville Libraries. So we thank you again for attending. The recording will be made available at the beginning of this coming week on MHC's YouTube channel, and we'll make that available via our social media. So be on the outlook, and hopefully this discussion will have even broader reach when people watch the video as well. So thank you again for coming, and thank you for participating, and have a great evening.